Alright, this video has essentially been an entire year in the making. Today I'm going to be reviewing every single album that I've listened to in 2022. I'm going to be giving like 1 or 2 sentences for each album, so this video isn't like 3 hours long. So yeah, don't expect like any like super in-depth thoughts or anything. These are just quick thoughts. There's going to be a score also in the corner of this video, so you can kind of see how much I enjoyed it. I'm going to be going in chronological order, starting it off, of course, with January. Alright, the very first album that I listened to in 2022 was Souvlaki by Slowdive. While I do appreciate the explosiveness and the abrasiveness of bands like My Bloody Valentine, the more dreamy kind of side of shoegaze that Slowdive offers on this album is definitely what I gravitate towards more. I admire the commitment to the concept of this album, but I just can't seem to connect with The Weeknd as a songwriter or a vocalist. This is just pure ear candy right here. Like many of the Microphones albums, this album truly taps into the deepest part of my soul. The weirdness is, for the most part, definitely the best part about this project. The instrumentals on this album feel like cacophonous displays of technical talent combined with raw and powerful emotions, and all of this is served on a fittingly DIY lo-fi aesthetic. It's just some fun, but somewhat at times underwhelming jazz. This new Earl album has great production and vibes, but he just again tends to lack variety with his flows to keep me fully interested. Alright, and the last album of January, this is probably the most charisma that I've ever heard on a hip-hop album. Moving into February, the first album we have is Pony by Rex Orange County. There's too many awkward moments and too many instances of overproduction on this album to make it feel like a record worth returning to. The arrangements on this album are so clearly thought out, but still manage to capture a mind-blowing and intensely raw and emotional feeling. This has some top-tier songwriting, but I do wish that the production was just a little bit more memorable. I enjoyed this one on a first listen, but returning to it, the mixing is just kind of inexcusably bad. These are just some fun and summery jams that do occasionally suffer from a lack of vocal and instrumental variation. Simply put, this feels like an album that I've been needing all my life. If this was just an instrumental album, I feel like I would enjoy it probably a lot more. It feels irresponsible giving this album any kind of rating considering the heaviness of the record. Moving on to March, this album right here is a drug-induced descent into madness, and it's engaging the entire way through. With this newest project, Denzel continues to sound hungry while also delivering his most mature project yet. This is probably Death Grip's easiest album to listen to. I don't know, this one's a little bit overrated in my opinion. The vocal performances are fantastic, but the half-to-bake instrumentals really don't do much for me. This album works perfectly for background music or for studying or for falling asleep, but it also is just as entertaining when giving it your full attention. Maybe it's because I've listened to so much of Phil Elverum's music this year, but this one just kind of fell into the background for me. All right, it's April time. It's April time, boys. You'll notice that a lot of these earlier months, there's not that many albums, which is kind of weird. I guess I wasn't listening to music like that at the beginning of the year. It definitely picked up towards the end of the year. This Jeff Buckley album has extremely passionate and impressive vocal performances. The instrumentation's a bit of the time, but it's nonetheless impressive. This thing is transportative, dark, and dingy. This is some solid dream pop, but it does feel a little bit too one note when comparing it to some of their later work. I originally wrote for this album Rex wearing orange in county jail, but the charges were dropped. They were disproved, I guess. So shout out to Rex. This is a sweet, introspective, and hopeful album. Death Grip's production is so insanely good that even a project light on MC Ride vocals is still impressive. Man, God's P never sounded so good. This one's otherworldly, but strangely kind of comforting. The fact that this isn't mentioned in the same breath as Heaven or Las Vegas is kind of mind-blowing to me. It's May time, it's May time. Okay, I think this is where I really started listening to a lot of albums. The first album here features a varied instrumental palette, but often lacks kind of memorable vocal performances. This one isn't as memorable or varied as Stankonia, but it's still pretty solid. With this newest album, Kendrick tackles themes of grief, trauma, materialism, and fame with more nuance than I feel like I've ever heard. This album's full of bright and playful melodies that do a great job of portraying innocence and joy. This one's a dark and psychedelic jazz rap experience with some of Kendrick's best songs ever. This is Beach House's most varied and exciting work that I've heard yet. Man, I love some good old anxiety-inducing music that makes me feel like the whole world is crumbling before my eyes. It's great. This album feels exactly how the cover looks. It's breezy, it's warm, and it's colorful. This album has 20 songs full of some of the most beautiful lyricism and writing that I've ever heard. This band sounds eerily similar to Radiohead, but you know, it's still good. The lyrics on this thing are as harsh and real and cold as the music itself. This album does have some creative production, but the project does feel a little bit too disjointed and sleepy for me to enjoy it as much as I want to. Give me Denzel or Jid's album over this album any day of the week. Grammys, I'm talking to you. It's June time. It's June shine. Ooh. The instrumentals aren't as interesting or experimental on her past two albums, but the catchy hooks on this album definitely get the job done. It sucks. It sucks. This album has some beautiful songwriting, comforting vocals, and stellar chemistry. The scattered nature of the production and lyrics on this album creates an unpredictable and exciting listen. This one's a haunting and expansive sequel to the Microphone's classic album, The Glow Part 2. This thing isn't perfect, but it is a great and accurate display of youthful wonder and joy. That's what this album makes me feel. No, but for real, Drake embraced all my least favorite aspects of his music on this album, and it makes for an album that feels like it's 5 hours long. Honestly, this does feel like a less impressive part 2 to his self-titled project that he dropped last year, rather than a distinct or memorable moment in his discography. This thing's cinematic, it's ethereal, it's spacey, and it's enveloping. Oh, Jack Harlow, come on. Jack Harlow? What the heck? Sounds so bad that I can't even spit it out. Jack Harlow has somehow fooled people into thinking that he has charm or personality, but this album proves he has neither of those things. This thing is a reverb-soaked mess of a project that takes itself way too seriously. The production on this album feels like a primal but kind of holistic view of the vastness of the universe, and it's accompanied with a really unsettling tone throughout pretty much the entire project. This album isn't difficult to get through because of any terrible ideas or sounds or moments, but it's because of the lack of musical variety. From the buzzing horns to the punchy drums to the socially aware lyrics, this record is just full of quality songs. It's July time, baby, it's July time. Clairo's intimate and airy vocals on this album are great, but for the most part, the lo-fi and distorted rock aesthetic doesn't really sit well with me. This is just a wonderful feat of musicality by one of the all-time greats. This one's uncomfortable for me to listen to, and it kind of just turns my stomach into knots. That's not taking away at how good it is, it's tough for me to listen to. This isn't as good as How I'm Feeling Now, but it's still an impressive blend of hyperpop, synth pop, and mainstream pop. I can't really remember a time I've been more invested in a story in an album. While it's not as musically complex as Cavalcade, I do find this to be Black Midi's best album, their most replayable, and easily their most well-written project. This one's just as unique and creative as Hounds of Love. The only reason it doesn't beat Hounds of Love is because it just doesn't come across as bold of a statement in her discography. This one's a bit boring due to the extremely slow pacing, but it's still a solid mix of ambient and shoegaze, and it creates some expansive yet lonely kind of soundscapes and atmospheres. There's some decent ideas here, but the ideas aren't really well developed enough or recorded enough to make this feel like something worth returning to. And again, there's some fun moments on this album, some cool textures, but it's really overshadowed by the awful and whiny vocal performances. This thing's choppy, glitchy, disorienting, but surprisingly satisfying. Nothing groundbreaking with this album, but it's just some fun indie rock with loads of personality and some extremely catchy hooks. Man, this is taking longer than I thought it would. This one is some great punk music. MGK, take notes. Some quality pop music here. This is an album I can see working well for casual listens, but there's also enough going on lyrically and production-wise to the point where it's rewarding when you give it your full attention as well. Boring, snooze, sleepy time trap music. Joey doesn't really have anything of much depth to say on this album, but the production's amazing. the flows are consistent, and it's overall a quality hip-hop record. I respect the ambition on this album. Just a lot of the bolder kind of instrumental ideas don't really land. Confidence on 1,000 for this album. This album makes me feel like a baddie. This one's a little bit uneventful and lackluster. Didn't love it. Okay, we're on August. Let's keep it going. We're about halfway through, almost halfway through. This is some insanely impressive jazz that can get a little bit tiring musically at times. Adrienne Lenker, I think is how you say your name, is easily the highlight of this album with her calming vocals and intelligent lyricism. But the lack of variety with instrumentals is definitely my biggest gripe with this album. Insane riffs, sweet vocals, rebellious lyrics, and a pretty tasteful combination of shoegaze, pop, and post-punk. This has some amazingly infectious grooves, catchy hooks, and tons of personality. This album's full of songs that portray how jaded we become as we grow old. It's all backed by beautiful string arrangements, striking riffs, and satisfying strong structures that grow and deteriorate, just like us. The vocals on this thing are obnoxious, grating, the mixing is straight up awful at points, and the songs just fail to provide me with any sort of emotional connection. I can't connect to this at all. This thing's a bold, blunt, and extremely honest look at relationships, abuse, and self-worth. I mean, this is Kate Bush we're talking about, so even her weaker projects are still gonna be enjoyable, but this one kind of just lacks the weird and experimental and off-the-wall energy that I've come to expect from Kate Bush. This has some cool moments that are definitely up to par with the ideas on Currents, but the anticlimactic song structures and the muddy mixing definitely leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, this is simplicity done to near perfection. This is just some reverby yet natural indie folk bliss. This album's a poignant, powerful, and cutthroat crop of tracks that are fueled by a desire for a better future. This is some weirdo, spooky post-punk stuff that definitely could benefit from punchier mixes. This dude definitely has potential, but for now, it's just a fine hip-hop record. It's really sad that a lot of themes on this album are still relevant today. This isn't really my type of music, but with this album, I can definitely see why Taylor Swift has the fan base that she does. This is easily the best hip-hop album I've heard this year. I mean, I've talked about it a lot, so just know that it's great. While the use of acoustic and more natural instruments is a nice change of pace with this album, this doesn't quite reach the levels of mystery and desolation and loneliness that Music Has the Right to Children did. DJ Khaled, we the worst music. This is just quality instrumental hip-hop from one of my favorite producers right now. It makes me want to get onto FL Studio and just make stuff. September time, the start of my semester. This month sucked. This one has some excellent songwriting, some well-composed piano parts, but I do think she kind of just misses the mark when it comes to creating enjoyable instrumentals to back up her passionate writing. This thing has lush and otherworldly instrumentation serving as a backdrop for some of the most unique and beautiful vocals I've ever heard. This is some decently creative dream pop with whiny and kind of grating vocals. This album by James Blake is a mature and reflective look at heartbreak, whether that be a love interest or just a friend. The drum production on this album is fantastic. The use of organs and synths is exciting, and the way in which they kind of create a cold atmosphere feels really unique. This is definitely a creative and unique album when it comes to prog rock, but I think a weak second half of the album kind of limits this. This is just lifeless, monotonous, completely uninspired. The vocal melodies are mind-numbingly boring. The overall vibe is just nothing that I can connect with. The vibes of this album are definitely consistent with the Microphone's greatest work, but the lackluster songwriting definitely leaves me feeling a little bit disappointed. This isn't the most complex jazz music I've ever heard or anything, but I do really enjoy the kind of expressive phrasing of the guitar. The psychedelic rock cuts on this album are easily the highlight, but the 808 heavy kind of electronic tracks don't really do much for me. Instrumentals are groovy on this one, but they definitely do lack ambition and progression. Some soulful, smooth, and sensual R&B. Go listen to it if you haven't. I don't know what these guys are saying, but it's groovy, and it makes me want to dance, and I like it because of that. Another R&B album here. This one's a little bit more experimental and creative. It is a bit messy at times, but it does overall come together as a really unique experience. I had high hopes going into this album, but I feel like Jockstrap kind of sacrifices memorable songs in order to experiment. It's October time, it's spooky season. Fishman's Long Season. This thing is a magical journey that kind of just creates a super vivid visual picture in my mind. The house drums on this one definitely do kind of take away from the ethereal atmosphere that I've come to expect from Bjork, but there is still enough of that mysterious vibe to make this feel like a worthwhile listen. I definitely see the appeal of this album, but the lack of instrumental progression and the vocalist's kind of lifeless delivery doesn't really make me enjoy this as much as I want to. The synth choices, experimental production, and insanely catchy hooks on this album make for an experience that feels truly unique, truly one of a kind. Whether it be through song progression, sound choices, atmosphere, spoken word sections, everything on this album kind of works in perfect harmony to tell a story. Closing your eyes, falling asleep to this, or just, again, having your eyes closed is definitely the best way to listen to this. Aside from some corny writing and the boring melodic tracks, this album's a decent enough vibe. I don't know. I don't have, like, concrete critiques on this album. It's not really my speed. Bro, the vocals on this album are insane. They're crazy. Go listen to this. This thing is dreamy, it's ethereal, it's sprawling. It has the perfect combination of meditative and serene passages mixed with absolutely blissful kind of shots of color. I was really, really disappointed in this album. There's some creative ideas here. There's some decent songwriting and some decent features, but the overall experience suffers from the fact that this album just sounds like crap. It's mixed horribly. Yeah, this is overrated. It's overrated jazz rap. The vocalist kind of tends to be somewhat out of tune at times, which can be kind of tough to listen to, but for the most part, I like the production. I like the vibes. This thing's an absolute classic. This is some hard-hitting and colorful hip-hop. I feel like Brad Taste would call this boomer music, but I don't even care. This is good. This has some decent ideas, but it's really hindered by some really bad mixing and uninteresting flows. I mean, Taylor couldn't sound more uninterested here. This is an album that I've had on repeat for like 2 months straight at this point. This thing is calming and it feels timeless. Okay, I think it's November time. Yes, we're moving on to November. As you guys are seeing, these later months, I've been listening to a lot more music, a lot more new music. Definitely, I feel like earlier in the year, I was just kind of repeat listening to a lot of albums. First one in November here, this has some fantastic samples and production, and it's backing some social commentary that feels nuanced and genuine. This is definitely the best Tori Amos album that I've heard. It's a lot more instrumentally interesting compared to Boys for Pele. The mixing on this is great, the production, the guitars are clear, the arrangements are thought out well and they're exciting. The writing's edgy, but it's never overly edgy. It's really likable, really endearing, and it feels introspective at times too. This is a really, really solid pop punk album. I mean, this is even better than the original album. The backing jazz live band just adds so much life. I don't know, this is fine, but there's a lot better post-rock out there. Guys, he did it. He did it. Drake made a listenable album. He just needed 21 Savage's help, even though he was only on like a quarter of this album. Who is Stanley, and why does she sound like Tones and I? This is gloomy, disorienting, intimate, but simultaneously expansive. This thing is absolutely stunning. While repetitive at times, this album really finds power and intimacy in its simplicity. That rhymed. Charlie Puth is a 30-year-old man that seems to have the emotional maturity of a 16-year-old. This is bland, it's boring, it's uninspired, it makes me want to go night-night, and it's about as mid or average as an album can get. While this thing isn't perfect, it's messy, it's tonally jarring at times, this is about as much as I could ask for when it comes to a final Brockhampton album. Yeah, this is probably Brockhampton's worst album since All American Trash, but you know what? I love the band. I still love the band. This is probably Phil's most memorable set of stripped back acoustic songs under the Mount Erie name. With this album here, Ryan Beatty fails to come up with any sort of memorable melody or hook on this pretty boring and uneventful album. Aside from some excessive distortion that can get a little tiring. At its core, this album is pretty much just as impressive as In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. It's honestly impressive how these guys consistently pick the worst samples and sounds known to man. Also, Beats might just be the worst song of all time. I've never really been a fan of Joji's vocal delivery, so when you pair that with a batch of songs that sound like they were extremely rushed and unfinished just to capitalize off the success of Glimpse of Us, you get this mess. The uninteresting lyrics and bland instrumentals really do Omar's immaculate vocals a disservice on this album. Yo, guys, look, it's Misogyny, the album, here it is. While this album is consistently atmospheric, most of these tracks do kind of lack the memorable songwriting that I have come to love, especially on her previous album, Titanic Rising. Emo reimagined in a chaotic kind of hyperpop context is as refreshing, creative, and exciting as it sounds. For an album that's clearly being made by talented musicians, this album completely lacks any passion or life. Literally every single track here feels like the band was barely even awake when they were recording it. This is absolutely unlikable garbage. It just screams, I was born in the wrong era, and that's probably one of the most annoying attitudes a person could have. The vocals on this album can occasionally feel unnatural and kind of forced, but the ethereal and otherworldly production usually makes up for it. This is some wildly creative hip-hop from the future. I definitely need to check out more Injury Reserve because everything I've heard from them has been great. Okay, the last month, we're here. Finally, this video is taking so long. I didn't think it would take this long. The Backseat Lovers kind of tend to wear their influences on their sleeve with this album, which definitely would be more of a problem if the production and the mixing wasn't so stellar. While I do appreciate the synthy direction of this album, it does feel like, for me at least, Beach House is gonna have to more drastically switch up their sound to keep me interested. For the most part on this album, Metro brings the best out of all the features and rappers here. This is also some of the best trap production you're gonna hear on an album today. Go check this out if you haven't. Even though it's only 28 minutes, this EP, I guess we can call it, is it's up there with Godspeed's greatest work. The energetic and upbeat tracks on this album are definitely the highlight. I do hope that Domi, is it Domi or Domi? I hope that they experiment more with kind of expanding their instrumental palette on future albums. The performances are impressive on this, the chemistry is evident, but I feel like more variation would make for a more engaging album experience. Harry does have an ability to write like extremely catchy choruses, but it does often get overshadowed by the extremely underwritten verses on this album. This album has some really bland production, the mixing also isn't great. SZA's pretty solid on it, but those two flaws kind of hold it back for me. The added instrumentation on this album often takes away from the intimacy and simplicity that I've grown to love with Nick Drake's work. This album clearly pulls influence from a lot of iconic kind of shoegaze acts, but at the same time it does feel uniquely kind of modern, grainy, and explosive. This album features amazing production and clever bars, but the occasional kind of one-note flows from Pusha T keep me from enjoying this as much as I want to. Yeah, I think Fantano's right on this one. The production really is amazing on this, but the lyrics are so painfully cliche that it's kind of a cringy listen. The first half of this album is extremely understated and really underwhelming for me. While the second half does feature some more fleshed out songs, I can't help but feel like this is just Simbi throwaways. Yeah, let's just say I'm happy Quedeca has stopped doing the whole rapidy rap, spiritual miracle, rippity rap, fast rap stuff. Because while the production is pretty good on this album, the vocals are cringe. The vocals are super cringe. The uninspired and repetitive vocal melodies on this album make for a pretty uneventful experience. This thing is truly transcendental. It's colorful, it's emotive. If you want some jazz to just lay down, fall asleep to maybe, or just be transported by, this is the album. The instrumental density of this record is exciting, it's stunning. Phil combining ambient and shoegaze elements is unexpected, but it goes over better than I ever thought it could. This is definitely my favorite Mount Eerie album. This is some easy dream pop listening. It really doesn't need to be as long as it is though. I don't really get the hype with this one. A lot of this album just feels bland and underwhelming. This has some cool experimentation, but the lackluster vocal performances and forgettable melodies ultimately dulls the experience. This is millennial humor in music form, and it's as unfunny and unlikable as it sounds. This just feels like an essential singer-songwriter album. The vocals are whispery and intimate, the writing's personal, the guitar performances are insanely impressive, they feel intricate but never overwhelming. This is some quality hip-hop with some varied beat selection. Simple as that. Yes, I only listened to this because of Fantano, because he put it as number one, his number one album of the year. But, I mean, this is seriously stunning. The ornate instrumentals paired with raw production and stellar vocals really makes for a special listen. While this thing is self-indulgent, it's overly long, and it's bland at points, a stellar second half and a compelling narrative all the way through really kind of saves this album. And the last one here, this album's full of filthy and abrasive tracks that are driven by disgusting lyrics, which I love, and insanely impressive and emotive vocal performances. All right, that's it. That's all the albums. That took longer than I thought it would. That was 180 albums. I don't know if I have anything else to say. That's it. That's all the new albums that I listened to this year. Obviously, I listened to more albums than this, but those were obviously repeat listens of albums that I've already heard before. So I'm pretty happy with this, you know? I feel like I expanded my music taste and explored quite a bit of different stuff this year. So yeah, I might do this next year. Who knows? This was fun to do, so hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Leave a like if you want, subscribe if you want, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.